All right, good evening, gentlemen. Very exciting. We finished last week the third Eis Gimel, the third chapter of our four-chapter discourse from the Rebbe Rashab. Ideally, I would really like for us to finish our discourse before Rosh Hashanah, before the new year. God willing, with the new year, we'll find a new something to learn, and I'm open to suggestions if there are people in the class who have interest in learning one thing or another. Or people who watch online as well. If anybody has anything in particular that they like to learn, I am happy to hear those suggestions before deciding my own thing. That has nothing to do with any of
what
those.
you're going to suggest.
I'm joking. I would love to hear suggestions of what you would like to learn. Okay, we are at the end of Eis Gimel. Instead of me doing a review, why don't we let the Rebbe Rashab do the review? We'll read the Kitzur. Actually, I think the Kitzurim may have been written by the Fiddich Rebbe, by his son. Either way, let us read the Kitzur, let us read the summary of this third chapter, which we've been learning for some time. The third chapter, if you'll recall, that we've been doing for months now, is all about Aveda. It's if the principles earlier in the discourse are true, what would our life look like? What would our service of Hashem look like if we knew that all of these things were true? Namely, the fact that that the creation of the universe is no change to God whatsoever, and God remains unchanged from before the creation of the universe. Let us read the Kitzur, the summary of the Rebbe Rashab at the end of the third chapter. Kitzur. When a person contemplates all of the above means all of the ideas that we discussed regarding the idea of I, God, have not changed, regarding the idea that the universe is absolutely nothing and not additional to, even though God is totally involved in creating the universe at every moment. Nevertheless, the existence of the universe makes no change whatsoever to the presence of God, or the closeness of God, or the reality of God as it was before the universe was created. And in fact, all of God's self-concealment is really just also godliness, and all the things that are created and appear to be separate from Him are actually totally bottled and totally nullified. So it turns out that really all there is godliness. The sole reality is godliness, just like it was before the universe was created. When a person contemplates all of this, tichlev tichseif nafshe, a person's soul will yearn and desire, will be consumed in desire for godliness. Just as in truth there is no other existence apart from God, and rather everything is godliness, so will it appear to our eyes. Pirush, meaning the animal soul will have no desire, other desire, apart from godliness, and will be utterly disgusted by evil. And we will see how the physical body, we will see with our eyes how it is the body is actually the Ein Sof HaSeviv Kolam, and is actually nothing but godliness itself, that physicality is not independent from godliness, but merely an extension of the infinite reality of God. This is what we meant by the love of with all your might, which is one of the last things we discussed last week. Let's say to escape from one's limitations, that there should be no independent reality from God per se at all. And how can the person, once the person reaches this state, how can he slake that thirst? How can he fulfill that thirst and quench that thirst with water? How do you quench that thirst for godliness? The answer is through learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. Through controlling oneself in all pleasures, even the permitted pleasures, he should control that which is superfluous. Force himself. Yeah, regarding that which is permitted and thus superfluous, and only focus on that which is necessary in the worldly pleasures. Yeah, v'yikshar es kol nafshe b'torah mitzvah shaydei zarei kol nafshe chiyunis v'chol dvarim agashmi shem hem mekalim chayos, that he should connect his soul to Torah and mitzvahs. That through this, his entire vital nefshar chiyunis, his vital soul, meaning his animal soul, really, I believe, and all of the physical matters that receive vitality from pleasures. And so too the physical object, Shabbanis lavshar mitzvah, in which the commandment is enclosed. Nasa kol kasher lekol makusher leinsev atmusa mehusa shemeluvish b'torah mitzvahs. Everything becomes totally unified,
connected.
Yeah, connected and unified with the Ein Sof, with the Ein Sof itself, the infinite God Himself. Shemeluvish b'torah mitzvahs, was clothed in Torah and mitzvahs. In other words, by doing Torah and mitzvahs, we reverse the concealment of God. We erase the things that stand in the way of us seeing the true unity of Hashem. We remove the distance that makes us have to thirst for Hashem rather than possess Hashem, is a different way of saying it, right? Which is why this satisfies the thirst for godliness, right? By doing Torah and mitzvahs, and through nullifying something to nothing, through the nullification of the independent realities within godliness, demaisa mitzvahs, the godliness of the performance of the mitzvahs, both in turning away from evil and in doing good, both negative mitzvahs and positive mitzvahs, in the simple explanation. And the main thing is that the aveda should be with joy. Mitzvahs gufa, and the joy comes from actually doing the mitzvahs themselves. And a person, through doing the mitzvahs, connects themselves to the Ein Sof, to the infinite God. Through this, a person makes their heart joyous. A person makes the God's heart joyous, so to speak, by doing the mitzvahs with joy. That God should shine and reveal the inner aspect of the Ein Sof into the person's soul, which we explained, this is the whole idea of joy. That darkness should be transformed into light, lagamre, entirely. And the person should come to revile evil with utter hatred. And you have no desire other than godliness, to cleave to it, and to take pleasure in godliness. And eventually, through his Aveda today, through nullifying the independent realities to God, then there will be in the age to come, in the Messianic age, in the day, the Asid Lave will be revealed the glory of God, and all flesh will see with physical sight that there is no physical existence at all. And the body is literally the infinite light of Hashem, which is what will only be revealed, as we explained earlier, will only be revealed when Mashiach comes. When Mashiach comes, we'll see how the Gashmias, the very physical matter of the body, is only an expression of godliness. Nizun b'pnimius. Of Shalom Shel Inyan. And we will take it will take its sustenance in an inner way. The body will receive its sustenance in an inner way, as is known that food b'pnimius comes from Ein Sof Atzmusa Musa Sev Kol Amen, comes from the infinite light of God. And the Rebbe adds parenthetically, it could be that this is the same idea, that the body will be a vessel for godliness. In other words, it will receive from the Ein Sof when Mashiach comes. Okay, v'zeu ki ner mitzvah. This is what it means, that the mitzvah is a lamp. Through doing mitzvahs and nullifying the independent realities to godliness, through this the light of Torah will shine. The light of Torah means the light of Torah as it is in its root, which is the infinite light of the eternal God. That there should be total transformation. And then the Rebbe explains afterwards. These Kitzurim are very interesting, by the way. just letting you know that these summaries that are printed with the Maimarim, if you read them carefully, they can give you insights into what you learned that you didn't see before. And also very interesting is that sometimes the summary takes something that was mentioned in 3 words and makes it into the whole chapter. Sometimes it takes the whole chapter and it makes it only into 3 words. In other words, the summaries, which again, I think these Kitzurim were written by the Frierdiker Rebbe, if I'm not mistaken. The previous Rebbe wrote these Kitzurim, show you how to learn the Maimers. It's very interesting. He says, I'm just noting that here because he says, and then the Rebbe explained afterwards, which he hasn't said for the rest of this whole chapter, right? Which is interesting. In other words, there appears to be to him, there's a change of subject, it seems, of some kind in the Maimer itself that I wouldn't have picked up on. It's interesting. So it says, Mefarish Achikach, it explains afterwards, Haderech Chaim, which is what we were talking about at the end of our chapter, the way of life, which is Haderech Umava, Yimshach B'Nis Ein Seif HaBilti B'Gvul, who al yidei techechas musar, that the way of life, in other words, the way to draw forth the infinite and unlimited God, who is the true life, is through techechas musar, is through the rebuke, the ethical rebuke. Sheyishbeit as atzma, a person should be rule over themselves, lesirachek mitanugim gashmiyim, to distance themselves from physical pleasures, v'mishpat litein tzedakah la'aniyim, and also he should judge himself to give tzedakah to the poor. And through this, there's derech chaim, which is the idea of Torah. The light of Hashem fills the world. And the last thing we did is we connected all the mitzvahs to mezuzah, which is at the entrance to the house. And indicates that everything that is within the house is nullified to godliness. This is the idea that a candle is a mitzvah is a lamp. Bittul yesh, the nullification of the independent reality. And that's why it's on the right side, because the right side draws close. The right side indicates the closeness of God, bringing the physical things close to Hashem.
There's something interesting here that it says that B'atid Lavo, now the neshama sucks its livelihood from their body. It's like that B'atid Lavo, the body will suck its sustenance from the neshama.
From the Ein Sof, Yeah. Okay. Without further ado, Eis Daled. And Eis Daled, finally, the final chapter of our Maimer, the final chapter of our discourse, is actually when we're going to go back and reconnect this all to Chanukah, which is what this Maimer actually started discussing, and that is when we started learning this Maimer, before Chanukah. Before Chanukah we started learning this, and now it's almost Rosh Hashanah, so it's a good time to... What? It's almost Chanukah, exactly. It's a perfect time to... wrap up this Maimer. We hope that with this we had a lichtige year, an illuminated year. Let's see what the Rebbe says about. The Rebbe says something very interesting about connecting this all back to Chanukah. The connection will not be immediately apparent. Let's put it that way. But really, this whole chapter is about connecting it back to Chanukah. Okay. Eis Daled, chapter 4 of our discourse. According to this, we'll understand the whole idea of the Chanukah candles. The mitzvah is to put it specifically on the left at the entrance to the house, and specifically outside. Why? The idea is, good evening, Amar Azal, the sages say, when Jews are doing the will of God, their work is done through others. What does that mean? When Jews are doing the will of God, their work is done through others. The Rebbe is going to explain to us what this interesting statement from the sages means. In order to understand this, in Eksiv, Kuma Hashem limnuchasecha chulu. Uksiv Hashem ish melchama. God, Kuma Hashem limnuchasecha. God,
rise.
Yeah, God rises for limnuchasecha, for your how would you say, for your rest, your peace. Uksiv Hashem ish melchama. But it also says that God is a man of war, right? You have an immediate question as to how to reconcile these statements about God. On the one hand, God is seen as a very peaceful God. God stands for peace, Shalom, which is very since the 60s we relate to. And then before the 60s, you have another view of God, which is, I don't know if that's when the two verses are from. I take it back. The 60s is not the dividing line. But you have an idea that God stands for peace, but you also have Hashem ish milchama, of course, we say every day. Hashem is the man of war, right? Yesh beis madregas. Yesh beis madregas milchama menucha. So you see that there are two levels, there's two aspects of godliness. There is war, and there is peace. Like Tolstoy, right? Like, for example, Shnayim Haleichmim. You have two people who are at war, who are fighting one another. When one is not nullified to the other, then they war. One with the other. And he is victorious over him. But the idea of rest, really it's not peace. Really menucha is really quietude or rest, which is when there's no war with him at all. But rather memelahu batal, the other party is nullified automatically.
Idle.
So in other words, idle. Sure, quietude, idle, tranquility, something like that. So you have different types of peace, right? You have war is when the two sides are not batal one to the other, right? Neither side is batal. You have two different ideas, two different inyanim, two different concepts, and there is no nullification one to the other. So there's a conflict. That's what war is. War is conflict. These two things are not resolved. These two things are not reconciled, and that's usually what the war is. The war is to find a reconciliation. It's a very, what's the word? It's a very brute force way of finding reconciliation. Although the truth is very interesting. If you learn the laws of war in Judaism and you learn also the idea of war al pi Kabbalah and Chassidus, really the truth is that war is not as brutal as it could be. In other words, war is not there's things in a sense that are more brutal than war, right? In the sense that a real war, according to halacha anyway, has very strict limits on the behavior, and the entire purpose of the war is to attain the bittul of the other side. That's really the purpose of the war. In other words, the purpose of the war is not to destroy your enemy entirely, right? Which is a very modern idea, even if at all. I don't know if it even makes sense in a modern context, right? The enemy stops warring with you not when they are completely destroyed. They stop warring with you when they become batal, which is a totally different idea, right? When they become nullified. In other words, when there is a reconciliation of some kind, which doesn't necessarily have to mean the total destruction of the enemy. On the contrary, usually the enemy is left with some semblance of strength, sometimes quite a lot of strength, right? It's just that the basis of the war, or the lack of bittul, has disappeared. You found the reconciliation. You found the way that there won't be war anymore, that these two can coexist, so to speak, in some sense. That's milchama. That's war. So war itself, in other words, what it sounds like is there's no idea, it doesn't sound like, of just war for its own sake, right? That's like chaos. That's not war, right? In other words, people just fighting because they're just fighting, that's not war. Milchama, that's also true, but that's not the distinction here. The distinction here is that war is for the purpose of attaining bittul, which is a different way of saying war is for the purpose of attaining some kind of peace, right? That's the purpose of all war in Torah. What?
Unless it's Amalek.
No, that also, it's a different story. But yes, you have a point. Whatever, it's not. Let's not overcomplicate unnecessarily. Sorry, I understand that's my tendency as well. So I relate. But the purpose of war is to find the bittul of the enemy. That's the purpose, right? Not to destroy the enemy entirely. As Ronnie points out, sometimes you have a war with Amalek, it's a different story. There the point is to destroy them entirely, but there's a reason for that, because the whole purpose is that the whole idea is that there are people who will not, that the whole nature of Amalek is that they can't be batal except they're being broken, right? But even that's not really true, as the Maimarim titled Reishis Goyim Amalek explain, that even that is not so black and white. It's not so. Anyway, so in other words, the point is here: what's war? The answer is war is not milchama in Torah is not destroying my enemy. Milchama is seeking the bittul of my enemy, which means that there's a positive purpose in war, and if war is fought with that in mind, according to the halachas of the Torah in the correct way, right, the whole point is to reduce the state of war as much as possible. War is necessary to find the state of bittul, the state of coexistence of some kind, where war is not necessary. The whole point of war is that there shouldn't be a war, in a sense, right? There is no war where the point of war is to have a war. There doesn't seem to be such a concept, right? That's war. So what's menucha, what's quietude, what's tranquility? Quietude and tranquility is where there's bittul without needing to fight. Right? In other words, we don't need to actually have this battle or this conflict to find the bittul. The bittul happens by itself. There is this coexistence, this nullification, there is no clash between two independent beings here in the first place, right? Ukamai, what's the example of menucha? Shloimeh, like the times of King Solomon. Shemitzad etzem gdulasay v'remusay. Mitzad his. I'm translating in Hebrew. I'm translating by saying the same word over again. That doesn't help. That by dint of his very strength, by power of his very greatness and exaltedness, Hayukulan betelim alav. Everyone was nullified automatically. The Nikra Ish Menucha, and he was called a man of peace, right? King David was a man of war, which is why King David was not allowed to build the Beis HaMikdash. King Solomon didn't fight any wars, and yet King Solomon was greater and had more power over the enemies of Israel than King David did. And the reason why is because when you're so much greater and so much more exalted than the enemy, no one wants to pick a fight, right? It's automatic. There's an automatic bittul. There doesn't need to be a milchama to subjugate the enemy and to find the bittul of the enemy, to find this coexistence. The coexistence is quite natural. No one, very similar to what people would say here. You would have a lecture from an adept Chabad lecturer could explain this concept in terms of self-confidence, that often the people that people attack, whether in the workplace or kids at school or whatever the context is, right, the people that are attacked and the people that are constantly undermined are often the ones that lack self-confidence, right? They're the ones that often are inviting it by their own behavior. They seem to say that if you'll hit me it will work, right? So that's why they get hit, right? Whereas the people who come with full confidence, right? If you come with full confidence, people tend to believe you, right? People believe what you say about yourself in general, right? So in other words, the same idea, right? King Solomon, or a related idea, the same idea. King Solomon, in his exaltedness, he was above the whole idea of fighting. Like it was hard to even imagine being in a war with King Solomon because he was so great, right? It would be like I don't know, it would be like seeing your hero at the coffee shop or something. Like, it doesn't make sense, right? You wouldn't see him in such a position. He's far too regal and far too exalted and far too great to dirty his hands with something like war. And that very reality actually affected his enemies. People who might have wanted to go to war with him couldn't even conceive of fighting with Shlomo, fighting with King Solomon, which is why he was a man of menucha, of quietude, of tranquility. He did not need to wage war at all. And the nullification of the other, the nullification of one's enemies that comes through tranquility is greater than the nullification of war. Even though in war you triumph over your enemy and you overpower him, and your enemy becomes nullified to you, nevertheless, there's still nevertheless not so much nullification, right? And the reason is obvious, right? Because correct. In other words, the bittul is not when nullification of the enemy comes through war. Good evening. When the nullification of the enemy comes through war, that nullification has been forced upon your enemy. And if it's forced upon your enemy, if it's imposed upon your enemy, it's not their inyan, right? It's not their concept. And something that is imposed can very easily be removed, right? In other words, the nullification of the enemy in war is only in as much as you have warred with them, right? Which is why, in a certain sense, war doesn't really make sense if you're trying to find permanent coexistence, right? Because the whole idea of peace through war is that by me doing something so we can coexist, not by you doing something, right? It doesn't come from you, it comes from me, right? But if I lose my ability to do that thing, then we'll no longer be able to coexist again. It's not really, it's what we would say in Chassidus, it's not really bepnimius in your enemy, the bittul that comes through war. It's not from the inside, it's imposed from the outside, right? So the bittul that comes through war is not so much, but if one's enemy is nullified to one because of one's greatness or one's exaltedness, then the nullification is absolute. Betachlis habittul, absolute is an absolute bittul. To the extent that the enemy is not really their own existence at all, right? Because if you think about it, is your enemy really your enemy at all if they choose not to be your enemy? And the answer is no, right? There's a natural, so to speak, an authentic, quote unquote, what we mean by authentic is from the inside. This coexistence and this bittul comes from within your enemy themselves. So they're not your enemy. They, on their own terms, exist in perfect coexistence with you. In the times of Shlomo HaMelech, the enemies of Israel, the enemies of the Jewish people, right, were not really their enemies. They chose themselves to not pick fights with Shlomo HaMelech. That was their decision. Because of his greatness, he didn't have to war with them. They simply decided, we're not going to fight, we're not going to pick fights with Shlomo HaMelech. And which means that really, they're not their own metzias. In such a situation, they don't exist relative to the person that they're in peace with, right? In other words, there are no two parties to a conflict here. There's Shlomo HaMelech, who's one party, and who else would be a party in a conflict or in distinction with Shlomo HaMelech, going against Shlomo HaMelech? And the answer is that there aren't any. There are no parties. There are no other people that would be against Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech, because of his greatness, because he was an ish menucha, because he was a man of tranquility, he had none of his enemies had no metzias. His enemies had no existence as enemies, as people in conflict with Shlomo HaMelech. Okay, it's interesting, there's Metzias Bifnei Atzmai, which makes them sound like they're an extension of Shlomo HaMelech, which also sort of makes sense. Whatever, we won't get into that. So too we understand in the human being's worship of God. Yeah, we all have to fight our own wars, of course. God created one thing across from another. In other words, God created aside from an opposition to all good things, God created a negative force or a negative reflection of that thing. Just as you have a holy soul which has a mind and emotions and thought, speech, and action, you have on the other side, the side of non-godliness, you have the animal soul, the Yetzer Hara, and the evil inclination, which are the intellect and the emotions of the animal soul. Right? I think we've noted this in this class before, but the Yetzer Hara, as typically described, like in the Talmud, which talks about the Yetzer Hara all the time, the Yetzer Hara are the natural midos of the animal soul. In other words, the animal soul's natural likes and dislikes, inclinations and disinclinations, are what we call the Yetzer Hara, or we call the evil inclination. Right? Why is that not the entire animal soul? Because the animal soul also has a seichel, also has an intellect, and through that intellect, the animal soul can be made a non-evil animal. Right? In other words, it's the natural midos, the natural likes and dislikes, loves and fears of the animal soul, or what we call the evil inclination, right? But you can train, your animal soul is not just an evil inclination, which is one of the revolutions of the Tanya, right? The animal soul is a full animal, which means that it also has seichel, and it's through the seichel that the godly soul and the animal soul can interact, and the godly soul can train the animal soul, right? As described in the Maimarim, like a small child training a wild beast, right? Like a small child training an elephant or something like that, right? You could, or whatever. We also say that the Nefesh HaBahamis comes in different sizes. Some people have an ox, some people have a sheep, some people have a lion, right? So there's all different types of interesting unkosher animals that you can, and kosher animals that your animal soul can be. Anyway, because it has seichel, because it has intellect, that's how the godly soul can influence it, right? So the Yetzer Hara, the thing that's evil, is just the natural inclinations, the natural midos of the animal soul. But that doesn't mean the animal soul is evil. On the contrary, the animal soul is just an animal, right? And it can be used. It comes from klipas nega, as explained right at the beginning of Tanya. It comes from the klipa that can go either way and can be transformed to holiness by the godly soul, right? So across from the godly soul, you have the animal soul and the Yetzer Hara, which are the seichel and midos, the intellect and the emotions, machshava dibur u'maisa, and you have thought, speech, and action. The sitra achra from the other side, the side that is not holiness, the side that is not godliness. Tzarich liyos milchama, and therefore there has to be a war, right? When does a war happen? There's two different agendas here. The Jew has within him two different agendas. He has a godly soul whose agenda is only godliness, and he has an animal soul whose agenda is itself, really, its own desires, as we explained earlier in the Maimer. So there has to be a war. There's no bittul here, one to the other. Each one has their own agenda. So they're in a state of war. They're in a state of milchama. Lahagbir hanefesh elokis lanefesh habamis. And we have to strengthen and fortify the godly soul so that it can be victorious over the animal soul. When does this war take place? The Zohar famously says, Shas tzleisa, Shas krava. The time of prayer is the time of war. Davening prayer is when we give the godly soul strength to dominate and to rule over the animal soul. In avoiding evil and doing good, as we explained earlier. And through the contemplation that we gave earlier, how do you give strength to your godly soul? I was telling someone earlier this week that there's a rabbi from Buffalo, New York called Rebbe Rashab, a very, very, very holy Chassid. For example, the Rebbe told him he should wrap 4 pairs of tefillin, which is very, very rare. A very holy and special Chassid. Was a shliach in Buffalo, New York. So he used to come in Fabrang in Morristown, New Jersey. And when he used to come in Fabrang, he used to Fabrang this time of year, Elul, right before Rosh Hashanah. One of the reasons they would bring him in Elul to come Fabrang for the yeshiva is because he would Fabrang very, very, very passionately about very, very basic things connected with like Elam Hazeh, right? He would bring about iskafia. You should be controlling yourself in what you eat, right? These very serious things that a lot of us don't take so seriously, right? These things about how you have to control what you eat and you shouldn't eat more than you have to. You should only eat what you have to. Basically what it says in Tanya, right? That's what he would bring about. So he would say things like, and I'm not going to do the impression, both out of respect and because it's not a good impression. Some people can do much better. He would say that when you eat like popcorn, right, or chips, right, like a food that's just like a snack food where you just eat and eat and you're not eating it to like be full, you're just eating, right, just eating like an animal, grazing, right. He said when you eat popcorn, it's like sending missiles to the Taliban, is what what he used to say at these Fabrangans. That's what I'm saying, is that I never, first of all, it's all my fault, and second of all, I never knew it would be in the news. It's for me eating popcorn, everyone. That's what, why would he say it like that? Why would he say it's like sending missiles to the Taliban? It's the idea that we're saying here, right? We are in a position to help the animal soul over the godly soul, or the godly soul over the animal soul, right? And it's our actions that we control that make the difference, right? We either send missiles to the godly soul, right, to help him in the war, or we send missiles to the animal soul to help him in the war, right? So the whole point of davening, right, is that you're supposed to sit down and think about what we learned in this mimer, about how the only reality is Hashem. And when a person contemplates that and makes that real at the time of davening and thinks about the divine reality, right, that's like sending missiles to the godly soul. That's why prayer is the time of war, right? You're strengthening the godly soul at the time of davening to give it strength to win in the war against the Nefesh HaBahamis.
But one can argue
that
eating popcorn like a pig is actually fighting the Nefesh Behemis, because you eat and you eat and you eat and you're never full. The Nefesh Behemis want to be full.
You're saying it's like heighten the contradictions, like a Leninist approach, right? In other words, if you get so lowly, if you hit rock bottom with your animal soul, you realize that you have to have a godly soul. So when you're sick from eating so much popcorn,
this is Shabbat Tzvi,
never...
God forbid, this is Shabbat Tzvi.
Shabbat Tzvi?
Shabbat Tzvi.
Why do you say that?
Because he wanted to get all the way down, in order to lift it.
I thought that's what you were saying.
No.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I apologize.
Never.
Shabbat Tzvi. I wasn't lending credence to the approach. I was just trying to understand what you were saying. Okay. However, there is a level of tranquility, right? What if I don't want a war with my animal soul, right? But I want my animal soul to respect my godly soul like the enemies of Israel respected King Solomon, right? So the answer is, there is something called Avedas HaTzadikim. There is such a state. It's called being a tzaddik. Whose animal soul doesn't mess with them? The answer is there's a tzaddik, right? Shemitzad etzem ava, that because of their very love itself, shemis'aneg al alakus, they take delight in godliness. Ad shemeis bara b'tachlis, to the extent that they are utterly disgusted by evil, as explained in Tanya. Sinura, they hate evil. The ein tzarich l'zeh milchama klal, and this does not require a war. Shemidas the nefesh habahamis memela misbatlin. Then the emotive qualities of the animal soul are automatically nullified to such a person, right? So if a tzaddik has a neshama that through its love of God, right? What's the metaphor? Is through King Solomon's greatness and exaltedness, right? So similarly, you have the tzaddik through their great love of Hashem. Their enemies are totally misbatal. Their enemies don't pick fights with them. Their animal soul has no interest in going against the plan of the godly soul. Like the melting of the is it wax?
Where is it?
Kahamas, see the line? Kahamas donag b'pnei esh.
Kahames.
Yeah.
Melt.
Yeah. Go on.
Like
that part I got.
Donag is wax.
Okay, I got the whole thing.
No.
Like wax melts before fire, Kenya avdun vanecha, so your enemies will be lost to you. And the sparks of godliness that are within everything automatically become assimilated within godliness, like a flame, like a candle before the torch. Okay, so that's a tzaddik. In other words, the tzaddik automatically, the tzaddik doesn't have to fight with the animal soul. The tzaddik, the animal soul, and all of the sparks of godliness within worldly things, in other words, all of the divine truths of all realities, right, are all nullified before the tzaddik. It's automatic. It's not because of what the tzaddik is. Just like Shlomo HaMelech's enemies don't want to pick fights with him, right? It's the same idea. That's the tzaddik. This is also the difference between davening on Shabbos and davening on a weekday. The tefillah d'chol, shas tzleisa, shas krova. So just as, in other words, you have a difference between a regular person and a tzaddik, right? So too, similarly, in a small way, in a microcosm, you have the difference between everyone's davening in the week and everyone's davening on Shabbos. Davening during the week is shas tlesa, shas krava. The whole purpose of davening during the week is to send missiles to the animal soul, to the godly soul. Aval Shabbos, beirer aser. On Shabbos, you are forbidden to beirer, is one of the 39 malachas. You're not allowed to sift, right? You're not allowed to sort. To sort on Shabbos, and of course, sorting is, according to Chassidus, what the entire Aveda of this world is. Our whole purpose here, the Jews' whole purpose here, is to sieve out and to sift realities and to find and reorganize reality to be according to the Torah, as we've discussed in this whole mimer, right? And it's not that on Shabbos the divine sparks, in other words, the worldly realities, are not refined and don't become more godly. On the contrary, what we're saying is that because of the great light of Shabbos, they all are totally nullified automatically. You don't need to do anything. In a tzarich milchama klal, there does not need to be a war. You don't have to go and rearrange the world on Shabbos and make it more in alignment with what the Torah says. Shabbos itself, because of the great light of Shabbos, refines the world. However, in order to have the Aved of Shabbos, you have to prepare with the 6 weekdays, where you have to go out and refine the world. And then afterwards on Shabbos there has to shine a great light, until they are nullified. Says someone specifically who toils and works on Erev Shabbos will eat on Shabbos. This is why the sages say that someone who goes on the way and doesn't know when Shabbos is, he should count 6 days and then keep the 7th day as Shabbos. Right? I have this is a very interesting Torah. First of all, there's a famous story of Rabbi Yisrael Ruzhiner. Yisrael of Ruzhin. There are several stories of him with his Melamed when he was in Cheder, right? Yisrael of Ruzhin was a descendant of the Maggid of Mezrich and an incredibly holy tzaddik. I think of the same generation as the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, if I'm not mistaken, around the same time. An incredibly great tzaddik with thousands and thousands of Chassidim. The way they don't make him no more, as they say. They broke him and they made him and they broke the mold, right? So we saw Ruzhiner when he was in Cheder, when he was a young boy. There's several stories about him. One story is that they were learning all the Rashis on the Torah. Rabbi Tzvi Kilov, who was an astonishing genius and a great tzaddik, as an unusual neshama, to put it mildly, he would ask every question that Rashi would answer, the whole Chumash, right? In other words, they started with Parashas Bereshis, they would read the pasuk, and the Ruzhiner, the child, would ask a question, and the answer would be Rashi. He would ask the same question Rashi was answering, and so to the next pasuk and the next pasuk, as they went. And the Ruzhiner did this through the whole Chumash, until they got to the story of Yaakov. Right, the story of Yaakov, where it says that the Malachim were ascending and descending, right? And you know the famous Rashi, where Rashi explains why does it say ascending and then descending, and it's because it's the changing of the guard, right? There's different explanations. One is that the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael are going up, and the Malachim of Chutz La'aretz are coming down, right? Because it was right on the border, which itself is interesting. It's in Yerushalayim, so I guess the border was by Yerushalayim. Whatever, that's the Rashi, right? And in Yisrael Ruzhiner, the Malamed's waiting. He's asked every other Rashi. He doesn't ask the questions. The Malamed says, "You're not going to ask a question on the pasuk?" And the young child says, "There's nothing strange about this pasuk." He says, "What do you mean?" It says the Malachim are first they're going up, and then they're coming down. What's strange about this? Doesn't that sound strange that it's first? Shouldn't the Malachim be going down and then going up, right? And the Ruzhiner says, "You don't ask questions about a dream." That's what the child said. That was his answer. And he says, "You ask questions. A dream doesn't have to make sense. You don't ask questions about a dream." That's one story. That's one story of the Ruzhiner with his Melamed. Another story of the Ruzhiner with his Melamed, which is that one was totally unrelated to this, at least in no way I can see. The one that's more related is that the Ruzhiner is with his Melamed, and they were learning this sugya, right? It's a very famous sugya in the Gemara. What happens if a person gets totally lost and they lose track of time? They're outside of civilization in the wilderness, and they don't know when Shabbos is, right?
Studied this one.
What? You studied this?
No, we studied it together.
Did we?
Yeah.
In this class?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
When?
Yeah. Long time ago.
Really?
Not long enough that I still remember. But
I don't remember discussing it.
Maybe it's Rabbi Tzvi.
No. We had like a few answers. One was saying that you should count from today.
Yeah.
And the other one was saying count 6 days.
I don't remember this, but okay. So we have this sugya, right, where the person is lost, and that there's different opinions in the Gemara about what the person should do if they don't know when Shabbos is. So the Melamed is learning this with the young Ruzhiner, and the young Ruzhiner is very struggling with this concept. He's saying, it's so weird. This is like such a strange situation. When would this ever happen? So the teacher's saying, what do you mean? Like you're out in the desert, like very far away, in the middle of the midbar, right? There's no civilization. There's no one there that knows when Shabbos is. Like, why is this so hard to? It's not weirder than a lot of other things in the Gemara. In other words, why is this? This is the one that's so hard to understand. And the Ruzhiner said, no, I don't understand. Couldn't you just look up at the sky and know that it was Shabbos? So the Ruzhiner, when he would look at the sky, he would know that it was Shabbos or a weekday. He could see. In other words, it's not to him, even as a young child, you could see the difference, and in nature, not from civilization, right? The Ruzhiner would look at the sky, he would know it was Shabbos. So, like, how could you possibly lose track? The world looks totally different on Shabbos, yeah? So the Ruzhiner said. Anyway, so you have this, the sages say, right, if you don't know when Shabbos is, it says you should count 6 days from when it is, and then you should make Shabbos on the 7th, right? So the question is, why not make Shabbos today and then count 6, right? In other words, why davka this way? Why davka count 6 and then make Shabbos? You don't know when it is anyway. You don't know what day is going to be Shabbos. May as well make Shabbos this day. That's actually the answer. The answer is, that's what the Rebbe Rashab is saying, that in order to have the spiritual Aveda of Shabbos, where the great light of Shabbos refines the world automatically, you have to have you have to have the 6 days of refining first, where the person works to refine the world, and only then you have the Shabbos automatically refining the world, right? B'derech Milchama, first there has to be the war, and then comes the menucha and the tranquility. V'achar kach, mishmar yom echad Shabbos, then you keep 1 day Shabbos, which is a day of tranquility.
What's the sal?
V'hadeya desvira le sham b'gemara.
The what?
Desvira le.
Svira lei.
Sham b'Gemara. The Mishmar Yem Echad Umayna Shisha Isutav Sham Yu'yin Sham. And if you want to know what about the opinion of the Gemara which says you count one day Shabbos and then you count 6 days of the week, the Rebbe says go study the Gemara. You'll see how that all works out there. That's what the Rebbe says. In other words, if there is an opinion in the Gemara that it works the other way around, and you'll see if you go learn the Gemara there, you'll see how that works out. That's what the Rebbe says. V'zeh bizman sheYisrael eisen retzenish hamakim. And this is what it means. I'd like to point out, by the way, that this same idea that first you have to have the birurim and then you have to have the rest. First you have to have the milchama and then the menucha was also by David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech, right? First David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech was this king where everything was in utter tranquility. But King David fought a lot of wars before there was the time of Shlomo HaMelech, right? So even in that story, it doesn't say it in the Maimer. This is my idea, but you can see there a parallel as well. That even there was before Shlomo HaMelech there was David HaMelech as well. So maybe that's a parallel here. This is what it means that when the Jews do the will of God, their malacha, their work is done through others. What does it mean to do the will of God? Which there's a lot of Chassidus about this phrase. He's saying here, doing the will of God doesn't just mean you tick the boxes on the mitzvahs. It means the love of b'chol me'edecha, the love of all of one's might, which is the highest level of love of God, to cleave to the Ein Sof itself through the doing of the mitzvahs. A very lofty level where you connect with the will and become nullified entirely to the will of God. And through, as we said earlier in the Maimer, through this you achieve Torah which means that the infinite light of God shines forth here below from its very source in the Ein Sof, in the infinite God Himself, and that's what we mean by the light of Torah. Then your work is done through others. That the netzutzos, that the worldly realities automatically become nullified within godliness like a candle before a torch. And then the world is refined automatically. The world becomes a godly place automatically rather than having to war with the world. In other words, this phrase that when the Jew does the will of God, their work is done through others, is actually describing something like the Avedas HaTzadikim. When the Jews are at the level of tzaddikim, in other words, when they cleave to God, and the Jew is simply an extension of God's will. They have the Ava b'chol me'edecha, which is drawing forth the Torah, the infinite light of the Ein Sof, into the world. When a Jew is at that level, which is really what we were describing earlier in the Maimer, which is the level that we all strive to, right, by contemplating the truths explained in this Maimer about the reality of Hashem in the world, etc., and the godly soul is in a state where the animal soul is automatically refined, and all these things that we're discussing, when the Jew is in that state, they don't have to war against the world, they don't have to fight. The world becomes a godly place, the netzutzos, the sparks of godliness within the world. In other words, the refinement of the world, the rearrangement of the world into a godly configuration happens by itself. It doesn't have to be through war, through contest with the world. This is the idea of the Chanukah lich, the Chanukah candles. The Greeks wanted to make the Jews forget the Torah and to cease from keeping the decrees of God's will. The Hainu has Gabrus Chachma de Klipa. The whole war in Chassidus between the Greeks and the Jews was not a physical war primarily, unlike, for example, Haman's decree was really the physical destruction of the entire Jewish people. According to Chassidus, the Greeks did not want to destroy the Jewish people. On the contrary, they wanted to assimilate the Jewish people within Chachma de Klipa, right? The negative Chachma, the evil Chachma that God creates in the world, corresponding to the Chachma of Torah, was found primarily in Greece. And this was the whole Greek program. The whole Greek program was the idea that the Jews should assimilate and that Hashem, God, should become just another God within the Greek pantheon, right? In other words, that the Greek Chachma was going to, so to speak, swallow Yiddishkeit, absorb Yiddishkeit, and it did many other cultures. They were the first multicultural empire on earth, right? The Greeks had many different cultures, and they were very open-minded. They had no problem assimilating from many different cultures, assimilating many different gods and things into their pantheon. The problem was, when they came to the Jews, is that the Jews were something too big to swallow. We got caught in the throat. It didn't work, right? They thought that their chachma and their philosophy was bigger than God was, right? And the Jews disagreed. Everyone else's small gods and idols all fit within the Greek chachma, right? The Jews disagreed. The Jewish God is not smaller than the Greek chachma. He doesn't fit within chachma de klipa, right? Doesn't fit within the pantheon. God comes before wisdom in Judaism, right? That's before worldly wisdom. That's ultimately the difference. So the Greeks wanted to dominate the Jewish people, chachma de klipa. That was their klipa, the corresponding klipa of chachma. Right, the negativity, the negative force within wisdom is what the Greeks were representing. Shetomu kol hashmanim shebeheichel, and that's what it means, that they impurified all of the oil in the sanctuary. Hainu chachmas chitzonius. This means superficial wisdoms. Shemetame chachmas atera chachma de kedosha, which came and impurified the wisdom of Torah and the wisdom of holiness, which of course this represents the assimilation and describes the assimilation. Wisdom is always called oil in Torah. Oil is wisdom, as is wine, by the way, both two levels of wisdom. Oil is wisdom, so when the Greeks impurified all the oils, which even in the pshat of the story is very difficult to understand. The Greeks didn't burn the oils, they just impurified them, right? As the oils enraged the Greeks, spiritually speaking, this whole idea of the pure oils that could be impurified by a Greek touching them was outrageous to the Greeks, because it's totally l'mayla min haseichel. It's totally not something you can explain rationally about the oil being pure and then becoming impure. The whole idea of spiritual, ritual purity and impurity is a chayk, is not something you can understand rationally, right? And the Greeks were davke impurifying the oils to make this point. They were saying that your whole religion makes no sense. It's not rational. Your religion is ugly. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit within our way of understanding the world, right? So we're going to impurify your oils. It's not like we're even doing anything, right? Or you think we're doing something. We're not even doing something by breaking all the seals on the oils, right? So they went and they were metame. That's what it means. Spiritually, they impurified the wisdom of Torah with the chachmas chitzonius, or the superficial wisdom. They basically came and said that the true way of understanding the world is through Greek philosophy and Greek wisdom. Your way of understanding the world is you have to at least see it through our lens. That's really what they wanted. They wanted Jews to view Yiddishkeit through the lens of the Greek worldview. That's what they wanted. V'zeu kasvo keren ashar chulu. And this is why they made them write on the horn of the ox. What did they make them write? That they revoke the God of Israel, I believe, right? Something like that. It doesn't say. I'm trying to remember what it says. They had to write according to the where does it say? I think it's either in the Gemara, perhaps in Midrash. I can't remember. Where they say they had to write on the horn of the ox that I have no part in the God of Israel, or something like that. So the truth is that superficial wisdoms, impure wisdoms like the Greek wisdom, impurify the mind more than mere dvarim betelim, than empty things or empty pleasures, because they only reach to empty things, only reach to the midos, only reach to the emotions. Thank you for checking. The impure wisdom reaches even to the seichel. So in a sense, studying chachmas chitzonius is worse. Yeah, you could think, right? Because a person could think, well, at least I'm doing something productive, at least I'm learning. But the Tanya explains, on the contrary, if you look at it in terms of what are you impurifying, what are you messing up, actually to learn chachmas chitzonius is worse than doing things with no purpose, than doing empty things. Empty things only impurify the midos, right? But if you learn superficial wisdoms, it impurifies also the seichel. מה שאין כן חכמוס ומסעלם שמטמא חב"ד שבנפש וחב"ד הוא מכלל עצמוס הנפש ומטמא כלולוס נפשי רחמנא ליצלן. Right? When a person, if I'm reading this correctly, one second, you can repair the level that is ruined, the level that has become impurified from its source, right? In general, this is an idea in Kabbalah and Chassidus, that things are repaired through their original source. So, just a second here, pardon me.